Just to let you know, we'll be starting shortly, but there is a group on a rare and endangered plant species walk on this campus at the moment, and we're just trying to find them in the rainforest. When we locate them, we'll ask them to slowly make their way back to the lecture theatre. I can hand out some of these shrubs here and we can pretend we're also having that experience if we want to join them. So it'll just be a few minutes and we'll get started. Apparently, I've been given the green light to start, so we shall get started. My name's Steve Gration. I'm the moderator guiding you through today's events. Yesterday I was an activist, today I'm moderate. So welcome to the second day of the conference. For those of you who are attending on the second day, thank you for being here yesterday. It was a wonderful day. Today also holds a lot of really good things that are going to happen. Firstly, to start the day, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which we meet, the Kumbameri people, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and the future elders. Also, I'd like to pay our respects to Uncle Graham Dillon, who did a welcome to country for all of the attendees at the conference yesterday. With that in mind, I'd also like to thank the sponsors of this wonderful conference, and that is GECO, the Gold Coast and Hinterland Environment Council, Griffith University, and the Queensland Government Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. We also have Green NRG Company, previously the LED Tech Company, who are also a bronze sponsor. And of course their conference supporters. I'll mention them throughout the day because there's about a dozen or so local businesses and enterprises that have also contributed. I'd like to thank the guest speakers, the workshop facilitators, and of course our wonderful volunteers who are going to help me and you through the rest of the day. Some housekeeping, emergency exits here, oxygen. I don't know what the composite of the oxygen atoms to the toxic and CO2 atoms are these days if it drops down from the cabin, but exits are here and here. The foyer is your area for signing on to workshops, and also morning tea and lunch will be served on the right-hand side. If we have an emergency, we will gather, the warden will gather us out to the right-hand side of the foyer as we go out towards the light rail. So that's in case of anything untoward happening, but I'm sure that won't be the case. Just to let you know, we changed the itinerary a little bit yesterday. We had Professor Brendan Mackey spoke yesterday in lieu of another speaker who became ill. So we will be replacing that with a wonderful film by Paul Gilding rather than Professor Mackey delivering his talk again. And in surf speak, you should have been here yesterday. So thanks, Brendan, for filling in yesterday and doing your speech yesterday. We are going to, I believe, start with a film, unless there's any other housekeeping that I've missed. I think the bushwalking people are slowly filtering back. I know, happy election day, I forgot to mention that. And I think a few people will be wandering in. They probably didn't anticipate how big the Senate voting paper was going to be and how time-consuming it was going to be. So I'm sure we'll get people coming from the election booths throughout the morning. With that in mind, I think I've given our techs enough warning that we're going to show a 16-minute film in lieu of Professor Mackey's speech being delivered yesterday. And it's by Paul Gilding, and the film speaks for itself, as most good films do, but it probably hovers between that curious world of fear about climate change and hope about climate change. So with that in mind, if we're ready, we'll roll Paul Gilding's film, The Earth is Full.
Let me begin with 4 words that will provide the context for this week. 4 words that will come to define this century. Here they are. The earth is full. It's full of us, full of our stuff, full of our waste, full of our demands. Yes, we are a brilliant and creative species, but we've created a little too much stuff. So much that our economy is now bigger than its host, our planet. This is not a philosophical statement, this is just science, based in physics, chemistry and biology. There are many science-based analyses of this, but they all draw the same conclusion, that we're living beyond our means. The eminent scientists of the Global Footprint Network, for example, calculate that we need about 1.5 Earths to sustain this economy. In other words, to keep operating at our current level, we need 50% more Earth than we've got. In financial terms, this would be like always spending 50% more than you earn, going further into debt every year. But of course, you can't borrow natural resources, so we're burning through our capital or stealing from the future. So when I say full, I mean really full, well past any margin for error, well past any dispute about methodology. What this means is our economy is unsustainable. I'm not saying it's not nice or pleasant, or that it's bad for polar bears or forests, though it certainly is. What I'm saying is our approach is simply unsustainable. In other words, thanks to those pesky laws of physics, when things aren't sustainable, they stop. But that's not possible, you might think. We can't stop economic growth because that's what will stop economic growth. It will stop because of the end of cheap resources. It will stop because of the growing demand of us on all the resources, all the capacity, all the systems of the Earth, which is now having economic damage. When we think about economic growth stopping, we go, that's not possible, because economic growth is so central to our society that it is rarely questioned. Although growth has certainly delivered many benefits, it is an idea so central that we tend not to understand the possibility of it not being around. Even though it has delivered many benefits, it is based on a crazy idea. The crazy idea being that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. And I'm here to tell you, the Emperor has no clothes, that the crazy idea is just that, it is crazy. And with the Earth full, it's game over. Come on, you're thinking, that's not possible. Technology is amazing. People are innovative. There are so many ways we can improve the way we do things. We can surely sort this out. That's all true. Well, it's mostly true. We are certainly amazing, and we regularly solve complex problems with amazing creativity. So if our problem was to get the human economy down from 150% to 100% of the Earth's capacity, we could do that. The problem is we're just warming up this growth engine. We plan to take this highly stressed economy and make it twice as big, and then make it 4 times as big, not in some distant future, but in less than 40 years, in the lifetime of most of you. China plans to be there in just 20 years. The only problem with this plan is that it's not possible. In response, some people argue, but we need growth. We need it to solve poverty. We need it to develop technology. We need it to keep social stability. I find this argument fascinating, as though we can kind of bend the rules of physics to suit our needs. It's like the Earth doesn't care what we need. Mother Nature doesn't negotiate. She just sets rules and describes consequences. And these are not esoteric limits. This is about food and water, soil and climate, the basic, practical and economic foundations of our lives. So the idea that we can smoothly transition to a highly efficient, solar-powered, knowledge-based economy, transformed by science and technology, so that 9 billion people can live in 2050, a life of abundance and digital downloads, is a delusion. It's not that it's not possible to feed, clothe and house us all and have us live decent lives. It certainly is. But the idea that we can gently grow there with a few minor hiccups is just wrong. And it's dangerously wrong, because it means we're not getting ready for what's really going to happen. See, what happens when you operate a system past its limits and then keep on going at an ever-accelerating rate is that the system stops working and breaks down. And that's what will happen to us. Many of you will be thinking, but surely we can still stop this. If it's that bad, we'll react. Let's just think through that idea. Now, we've had 50 years of warnings. We've had science proving the urgency of change. We've had economic analysis pointing out that not only can we afford it, it's cheaper to act early. And yet the reality is we've done pretty much nothing to change course. We're not even slowing down. Last year on climate, for example, we had the highest global emissions ever. The story on food, on water, on soil, on climate is all much the same. I actually don't say this in despair. I've done my grieving about the loss. I accept where we are. It is sad, but it is what it is. But it is also time that we ended our denial and recognised that we're not acting, we're not close to acting, and we're not going to act until this crisis hits the economy. And that's why the end of growth is the central issue and the event that we need to get ready for. So, when does this transition begin? When does this breakdown begin? In my view, it is well underway. I know most people don't see it that way. We tend to look at the world not as the integrated system that it is, but as a series of individual issues. We see the Occupy protests, we see spiralling debt crises, we see growing inequality, we see money's influence on politics, we see resource constraint, food and oil prices, but we see mistakenly each of these issues as individual problems to be solved. In fact, it's the system in the painful process of breaking down. Our system of debt-fueled economic growth, of ineffective democracy, of overloading planet Earth is eating itself alive. I could give you countless studies and evidence to prove this, but I won't, because if you want to see it, that evidence is all around you. I want to talk to you about fear. I want to do so because, in my view, the most important issue we face is how we respond to this question. The crisis is now inevitable. The issue is, how will we react? Of course, we can't know what will happen. The future is inherently uncertain, but let's just think through what the science is telling us is likely to happen. Imagine our economy when the carbon bubble bursts, when the financial markets recognise that to have any hope of preventing the climate spiralling out of control, the oil and coal industries are finished. Imagine China, India and Pakistan going to war as climate impacts generate conflict over food and water. Imagine the Middle East without oil income, but with collapsing governments. Imagine our highly tuned just-in-time food industry and our highly stressed agricultural system failing and supermarket shelves emptying. Imagine 30% unemployment in America as the global economy is gripped by fear and uncertainty. Now imagine what that means for you, your family, your friends, your personal financial security. Imagine what it means for your personal security as a heavily armed civilian population gets angrier and angrier about why this was allowed to happen. Imagine what you will tell your children when they ask you, so in 2012, Mum and Dad, what was it like when you'd had the hottest decade on record for the third decade in a row, when every scientific body in the world was saying you've got a major problem, when the oceans were acidifying, when oil and food prices were spiking, when they were rioting in the streets of London and occupying Wall Street, when the system was so clearly breaking down, Mum and Dad, what did you do? What were you thinking? So how do you feel when the lights go out on the global economy in your mind? When your assumptions about the future fade away and something very different emerges. Just take a moment and take a breath and think, what do you feel at this point? Perhaps denial, perhaps anger, maybe fear. Of course, we can't know what's going to happen, and we have to live with uncertainty. Well, when we think about the kind of possibilities I paint, we should feel a bit of fear. We are in danger, all of us, and we've evolved to respond to danger with fear, to motivate a powerful response, to help us bravely face a threat. But this time, it's not a tiger at the cave mouth. You can't see the danger at your door, but if you look, you can see it at the door of your civilization. That's why we need to feel our response now while the lights are still on, because if we wait until the crisis takes hold, we may panic and hide. If we feel it now and think it through, we will realise we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Yes, things will get ugly, and it will happen soon, certainly in our lifetime, but we are more than capable of getting through everything that's coming. You see, those people that have faith that humans can solve any problem, that technology is limitless, that markets can be a force for good, are in fact right. The only thing they're missing is that it takes a good crisis to get us going. When we feel fear and we fear loss, we are capable of quite extraordinary things. Think about war. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it just took 4 days for the government to ban the production of civilian cars and to redirect the auto industry, and from there to rationing of food and energy. Think about how a company responds to a bankruptcy threat and how change that seemed impossible just gets done. Think about how an individual responds to a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness and how lifestyle changes that previously were just too difficult suddenly become relatively easy. We are smart. In fact, we really are quite amazing, but we do love a good crisis. And the good news, this one's a monster. Sure, if we get it wrong, we could face the end of this civilization. But if we get it right, it could be the beginning of civilization instead. And how cool would it be to tell your grandchildren that you were part of that? There's certainly no technical or economic barrier in the way. Scientists like James Hansen tell us we may need to eliminate net CO2 emissions from the economy in just a few decades. I wanted to know what that would take, so I worked with Professor Jørgen Randers from Norway to find the answer. We developed a plan called the 1 degree war plan, so named because of the level of mobilisation and focus required. To my surprise, eliminating net CO2 emissions from the economy in just 20 years is actually pretty easy and pretty cheap. Not very cheap, but certainly less than the cost of a collapsing civilization. We didn't calculate that precisely, but we understand it's very expensive. You can read the details, but in summary, we can transform our economy. We can do it with proven technology, we can do it at an affordable cost, we can do it with existing political structures. The only thing we need to change is how we think and how we feel. And this is where you come in. When we think about the future I paint, of course we should feel a bit of fear. But fear can be paralysing or motivating. We need to accept the fear and then we need to act. We need to act like the future depends on it. We need to act like we only have one planet. We can do this. I know the free market fundamentalists will tell you that more growth, more stuff and 9 billion people going shopping is the best we can do. They're wrong. We can be more, we can be much more. We have achieved remarkable things since working out how to grow food some 10,000 years ago. We've built a powerful foundation of science, knowledge and technology, more than enough to build a society where 9 billion people can lead decent, meaningful and satisfying lives. The Earth can support that if we choose the right path. We can choose this moment of crisis to ask and answer the big questions of society's evolution. Like, what do we want to be when we grow up? When we move past this bumbling adolescence where we think there are no limits and suffer delusions of immortality? Well, it's time to grow up, to be wiser, to be calmer, to be more considered. Like generations before us, we'll be growing up in war. Not a war between civilizations, but a war for civilization, for the extraordinary opportunity to build a society which is stronger and happier, and plans on staying around into middle age. We can choose life over fear. We can do what we need to do. But it will take every entrepreneur, every artist, every scientist, every communicator, every mother, every father, every child, every one of us. This could be our finest hour. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Paul. I think we have a few moments if anyone would like to make a comment. If I could get the microphone people ready. If anyone would like to put their hand up and perhaps make a comment on what they received from viewing that film. Is there anyone who'd like to throw in a little gem or support Paul or give some insight that reflects on what Paul's just told us? Put your hand up now. That's all right. Oh, good. Yes. Thanks, Sheila. Just while the microphone's getting there, that idea of stuff, collecting stuff, too much stuff. Thanks.
I worried about his acceptance of the 9 billion people, which is another 1.7 billion in the next, 20 years, 30 years? And he didn't address that at all, and that concerned me. I don't think we need to accept it. I think we need to really, really push for a sustainable population level. So.
Terrific insight. Anyone else? Yes, down here in the second row.
Thank you. And whilst I think, he made some really great points, and one of those being, I don't know that it was necessarily made for a group like us who are already converted, but at the same time, I really liked how he challenged the notion of economic growth. And having attended yesterday at the conference, it was really heartening to hear in this presentation this morning that was challenged, because I'm not sure it was challenged yesterday in amongst the business and investment topics, although there were, I do acknowledge there were, glimmers of hope amongst that. But I think this might have been great for yesterday to really, challenge people's mindset about this obsession with economic growth.
Yes, so. Terrific. That notion that all growth is good. I'm sure people who have cancerous tumours growing don't feel that all growth is good. So the idea of growth, all growth is good, is highly questionable. We have someone else wants to make a comment. Just beside you there, Ali. Sorry, up the top there and then here. Yes. Go. Oh, we're getting the technology sorted out. We'll go over here.
Oh, hi, thank you. I just wanted to, Fiona Armstrong from Climate and Health Alliance, I just wanted to make the comment. I love Paul's work, and I think that his book, The Great Disruption, was really a great intervention in terms of how we think and also preparing for people for disruption. But I think the fact that he said those things in 2012 is really interesting, because it just shows you how fast the thinking progresses on this. And I think, he probably would give a very different presentation today, and just his comments about the fact that economies will collapse. I think those that don't transition will, but what we're also seeing is that this, since he made that, there's such a massive growth in the green economy globally, and the investment, trillions of dollars in renewable energy. We've got such huge growth there now that the failure will come from not making that transition, but actually that economy is growing incredibly fast.
Terrific. We've got one up here and then down here, and then we might move on with the morning's events with our guest speakers. Thank you.
What dawned on me when my mind started to wander and you look at all the banners and you look down there at beautiful Lois and Griffith Uni and all the people that are here is that we're it for the Gold Coast. This is it. These are the people that have given up their Saturday because they're passionate about climate change and fixing things on the Gold Coast. And so it's up to us, it's up to all the people in this room to take on board what was said on the TED Talk and take on board what's going to be said and drive action, drive behavioural change for the Gold Coast. Good on you guys.
Thank you. And Doral, thank you.
I think that we have to understand also that the financial system that we've got is not the only financial system. There's different models. So you can still have a financial system, but it doesn't have to glorify tobacco sales and casino sales and this type of thing. You know, you can actually focus in the environment and health and happiness, and
so we don't have to glorify greed, and we don't have to honour greed, and we don't have to listen to what the greedies are trying to tell us.
Yeah, yeah. And also on that same challenging note is our political system. Just because we sort of call it democracy, that there's other systems from other countries that are much more democratic than what ours is. So we've got to challenge that as well.
Thanks, Doral. And the point I made yesterday, Socrates, who was at the heart and seat of democracy, said democracy only works when the public are informed and knowledgeable. And of course our mass media make sure we get the misinformation and spin. So therefore, are we living in a democracy when people vote on the basis of lies, misinformation and spin? And we'll find out today how that turns out for this country. With that in mind, the idea, Katie's idea of we're at the heart of driving the agenda on the Gold Coast, but you know what? Barbecues, dinner parties, family gatherings are a great place to drop the stone into the pond. Thank you so much. I just smashed the controller for the next speakers. That's the way to get control of this conference. Dinner parties, family gatherings. I had a family member, I was saying I'm attending this conference, and a family member said, "Are you for or against climate change?" I said, "Wrong question. I accept that it exists. Can we start the conversation from there?" And also the idea that unless you can prove that it's human-caused climate change and global warming, then why should we spend resources and money and time on it? And my analogy is, okay, so every bushfire in Australia, if it's naturally caused by lightning or dry lightning or natural combustible activity, unless we can prove a human caused that fire, all those people whose properties, businesses and lives are at risk, we don't send the firefighters out for them because nature's always done that. Bad luck. I mean, on that sort of Australian analogy, that's my counter-argument over dinner table conversation for, well, let's actually send out the firefighters and see what we can do. With that in mind, I just want to confirm who our next speaker is. Is it Jerry? David's here? Okay, great. I shall flick back a couple of pages and introduce our guest speaker, David King. I've done a little bit of homework on David. Dr. David King is from Doctors for the Environment. He's an academic GP at the School of Medicine, UQ. He's course coordinator of general practice, clinical rotation, and teaches evidence-based medicine. He's the Queensland chair of the Doctors for the Environment since 2005 or 2003. He's written extensively about the broader aspects of environmental determinants and risks to health. So would you please welcome Dr. David King.
Okay, so once I sort out the technology. So, welcome those who have turned up to hear this message, to come along for your checkup. Yeah, where do we start? We've only got 6 minutes in this consultation. No, actually, I think I've got 15 or 20, but what sort of problems can I address in this short time? I can only really give you an overview, and it's a process over time. As a GP, I understand that. I understand about dealing with uncertainty and motivating people to change. Just to follow on from Paul Gilding, the grief. I don't know that I ever get over the grief of people who are smoking, but I do accept that some people only give up after their first heart attack. The problem is sometimes the first heart attack kills. Some people survive and then stop smoking. But I work hard because some of my patients will stop smoking before they have that heart attack, or they never start in the first place. And I'll come back to it at the end. But when people come in for a skin check, some people are willing to take the advice to start wearing a hat and using sunscreen and to prevent. So we're all at different stages of the journey. But as a GP, I'm about change, getting people to change. Even when people come in with mental health problems, if they want to recover, they've got to change something. The way that they're doing it now is not working. So I'm going to focus on the health aspects. It's great to follow after Paul Gilding because there's a lot that I don't need to say now, so I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. And being a doctor, I thought it would be nice to do it as how I approach a consultation. Diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. So often people come to me, Doc, can you fix this? And I, rather than saying, yeah, just take this drug or do this lifestyle change, I've got to say, hang on, sit on my hands or keep my mouth shut. Okay, tell me more to really understand what the problem is before I can address it. Or if I'm about to educate someone, I've got to say, well, what do you know first? What do you fear? What are your fears, concerns, expectations? I can't manage it until we're on the same page, until we have a shared understanding. So I don't have to say too much about this. I'm going to go really quickly. But just to set the context. I give a drug if there's a p-value of 5% that it might be effective, and yet the certainty of climate change is many, 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 many times above that. So when people say, how can you be certain? How can you be certain that that drug you're taking at the dinner party is doing it when we have p-values of 0.05? We have 5% certainty levels. Look at the certainty that humans are driving climate change. We're never certain about anything in life. In fact, one of the things that young GPs struggle with is how to deal with uncertainty. And that's what I try to teach my patients, how to deal with uncertainty. We're all going to die. We don't know how. We cannot not prevent cancer in all of us, but we're minimising risk. And if we frame climate change as risk minimisation, I think we can, and health, we can get the message through. So why is it not more accepted? Because it's hard. Because it actually means we have to make a change. And also because there's a battle between good and evil that's been going on for a long, long time. Even back in the 1850s to 1870s in Europe, the public health movement, we had wives of industrialists against their husbands who employed workers for 12 hours a day, children, and had poor houses and thought that's how you had to do it. And their wives were saying, no, we need to make sure they get some sunlight, they get good nutrition, good housing. And that's where the public health movement came from. And now we're going back to a plutocracy where it's about cheap wages and you don't care about the health of people. This has been a battle that goes on forever. The global commons, the greater good versus the wealth and benefit of a few. And the fossil fuels, we know that when Peabody Coal went bankrupt and the auditors went through their books, that they were putting millions into the Heartland Institute and other climate denialist groups and employing, Naomi Oreskes in her book highlighted this many years ago, but now that evidence is really coming to the fore for certain, that they've actually employed the same PR companies that big tobacco used to cast doubt that cigarettes cause lung cancer because there was no randomised controlled trials. In fact, thinking about that, when we surveyed some medical students about climate change, And one said, well, I won't believe it unless we have a randomised controlled trial, because that's the gold standard of research. And we thought, okay, which control earth are you going to use to see what sort of experiment we're carrying out on this one that we own? They didn't really get it. But there's different evidence for different types of problems. But it is hard to change, because lowering emissions means that we have to leave coal in the ground. And there's a lot at stake for those who have money in future predicted earnings. And that's why Peabody Coal put millions into advertising about coal is good for humanity and we need to solve energy poverty in India, etc. And had ads on their website about healthy kids running around, and they put money into asthma treatments and a lot of greenwash. I agree with Paul again that this is in context. We're looking at climate change, but it's only one of many that we're actually not living sustainably, and we've already crossed a number of planetary boundaries. Not only climate change, but also the nitrogen and phosphate cycles. So the farmers in this room, when we hear about growing food and next, that comes into it as well. And our loss of species. The sixth great extinction is already happening. And the first mammal, Australia is good at gold medals, at winning things. So we've lost a mammal species entirely due to climate change recently up on the Northern Reef. So Australia's won that too, the first loss of a mammal species. So again, I can go through this quickly because Paul Gilding's already said it, that we're burning up our natural capital. So there's going to be a crash. In fact, the latest projections from the United Nations Population Agency suggest that we're not going to peak at 9, that we're likely to get to 11 million on current growth, because growth hasn't slowed in Africa, and there'll be 1 billion extra Africans added in the next 40 years. Probably most of them are going to head to Europe if they can get there. So this is the problem, isn't it? Too many people, and we all want to live like in the United Arab Emirates or in the Gold Coast. Oh, sorry. I better be nice to my hosts, having come down from Brisbane. But the other problem is that, and this is what, as a doctor and as a GP, when someone comes in, I need to challenge your values. You know, why do you want that house and working so hard and you're tired? What is important to you in your life? And the problem here is that we think we're above the world, that we're not a biological species, that somehow we're better and that we can control it and abuse it and extract, and it's there for our use. We've heard about the trickle-down economics last night from Rod Quantock, from The Comedian. Piss-down economics is what he was calling it. And that externalities, if you'd actually look at the full cost of coal, it costs 3 times more than what we're paying for our coal-fired power in environmental and health costs. Coal kills an awful lot of people in air pollution and in fly ash and in the transport. Coal kills a lot of people around the world. Not so many in Australia, but certainly lots of people in India are suffering health effects from coal. As well as, what are we up to now? 7th or the 8th case of coal miners' lung now in Queensland? People who'll die a very distressing death before their time, running out of oxygen and puffing hard. It's actually not fun watching people with chronic lung disease. And we've already, a good segue following Kenneth Boulding, from Paul Gilding. Kenneth Boulding, a Quaker economist, a Nobel laureate. This is his quote: "Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a finite planet is either mad or an economist, or is in sway to economists like our politicians." So we know what the diagnosis is. Well, I think we really need to understand it deeper, and maybe in the groups we can say, what are our attitudes? We actually are part of the problem as well. I try and cycle everywhere and do my best, but when I've done my global ecological footprint, I still would need 2 Earths to live on if everyone lived like I do, despite the fact that I do the best that I can. As I say, I cycle, commute everywhere, and hardly use any electricity, and etc. But unfortunately, the odd aeroplane that I hop onto really spoils it, particularly if I'm flying off to other parts of the country to go to climate change conferences And then my wife has a laugh at me, you're flying around the country to solve the problems of the world and creating more. So we're the problem as well. We need to acknowledge that. So I'm just going to quickly focus on the health risks. The IPCC future risks by 2050, there's a whole lot of issues. So I think we know most of these, but 15,000 deaths from heat stress alone in Australia is predicted to occur. And dengue could reach as far down as Sydney, because with a degree or two of warming, and unfortunately the species that carries dengue also carries Zika virus. Hopefully people don't bring it back from Rio, and there's potential for it to get into Australia as well as other parts of the world. And it's the vulnerable, the sick and the young that are going to suffer most. We know this, there's evidence for this. We know that the death toll, the WHO has done lots of studies and actually calculated how many people have died from climate change or climate change related disease burdens around the world. And unfortunately, as I said, it's an ethical issue. The third world is the global south is the ones to suffer, even though they didn't create the problem. We're exporting our wastes, our problems. We can not only exporting our coal, but we're exporting our emissions to the crowded countries that are at least able to adapt. I'll skip through some of these, but we do know that with increased temperatures, we get more food and waterborne diseases. That's Brisbane in the floods in 2011, more cyclones. That's along the fancy riverfront area. As well as the 35 dead in floods, there was a huge burden on the health system. Cancellation of 1,400 elective surgeries and 37 million for mental health services and 18 million provided to repair health infrastructure. A lot of GP surgeries were flooded, so people did suffer health effects, even just in that one example close to home. We know about bushfires and the impact on lives and on health. So heat stroke will kill more than bushfires, although bushfires make the news and very scary. But and bushfires have been around ever since Australia was a dry continent, I guess. It's just that more people living close to bushland areas and fires happening earlier and more intense with the huge heat days. As I said, heat waves is the major problem. That a decade or more ago in Europe, huge deaths from heat. Some heat wave deaths in Australia, but it's predicted to increase. You can see there in India and Pakistan, even just last year, there are lots of deaths. And I worry that if it happens during Ramadan, because they don't even want to drink during the day, that it's going to cause massive number of deaths. So this is just a prediction of temperature-related deaths under different scenarios there. You can see they're going to increase greatly for Australia from the Garneau Climate Change Report 2008. If you think about what it's like on a hot day, imagine trying to work outside with a few degrees hotter and more humid days. So it's going to affect our economy. And they've calculated the number of dangerous days outside. So here's an example. Number of days in Perth predicted to be dangerous for outdoor workers doing physical labour, estimated to increase from 1 to 21 days per year by 2070. That's if you're acclimatised. And 17 increased up to 67. And we've had a few examples of people dying. There was an army trainee in the Northern Territory who died on training exercise a year or two ago from heat stress, a very fit guy. So it is an issue. And mental health issues, we'll probably hear about that from our farmers. An 8% increased risk of suicides in rural New South Wales when there's, for every 300 millimetre decrease in annual rainfall. And food insecurity. As carbon is said to be good for plants to make them grow, but hotter weather and dryness is not good for them. Which is going to mean lots and lots of refugees, that we won't be able to stop the boats. And surely those people have a right to live somewhere and to be able to live and to Okay, so let's move on to the treatment, responding to the challenge. Because we can't really give up hope, I don't think. Even if you're suffering from ill health, humans want to keep on going. We don't want to just give up and turn up our toes. We want to do the best that we can. Although, if we get to 4 or 6 degrees, it might be difficult for many of us to survive. Particularly if there's a lot of flooding of delta areas and displaces billions of people in Bangladesh and other places. And they're not allowed to go and live anywhere else because they're already crowded. Many of you have probably seen this slide already. So it says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Imagine investing in a better world and we've wasted all that investment. Oh no. So I think that's the case too if we invest in health. We might not prevent you getting cancer, but fitter, healthier, better mental health. So to live healthily, it's worth doing it in for its own right to be active, even if we can't prevent all of our health problems with it. So I think if we can frame climate change as very much an individual, a personal, rather than an economic or a financial, it'll get traction with people. We're all interested in health. And so there's some quotes here. For too long, people have perceived climate change as an environmental issue, a concern of the environmentalist, of greenies. Did you say before greedies or greenies? Greedies. I thought you said greedies. So we could have the greedies. Isn't it amazing how the IPA and the ilk like to appropriate the language for their own usage, you know, to twist the language to alarmists and warmists. And so all you warmists in the room. No, but see, it's a health issue. Surely we're all concerned with health. So how do we become healthier and happier? That's what most... I can remember once when I was backpacking and bumming around and meeting a yoga teacher, and he asked me this question, what's the meaning of life? And it floored me for a while, and I sort of was at a loss for words, which is unusual. And he said, to be happy, surely. And I thought, isn't that a bit hedonistic? But he was talking about real satisfaction and happiness. Isn't that what we all want? So how do we get that? Well, if we focus on health and what that really means, true sustainable health. So we need to reframe this problem as Paul Gilding does, although I'm not as optimistic as he is. We can use it as a motivator factor, just like sometimes we do need that scare. So the best time to get people to stop smoking probably is when they come in with a respiratory tract infection and they're coughing, and it reminds them of what they're doing to themselves. And then say, this is an opportunity to act, that we can clean up our cities and have beautiful living spaces, so that we can see that they're not necessarily in opposition, but they're forks in the road that we can decide to go one or the other. And then rather than just, if you tell a smoker, stop smoking, what do they want to do when they get to their next stressful situation? Reach for the cigs. Why is that? It's because it's doing something beneficial. It's giving them a strategy for coping. So what does a wise parent do if a toddler is playing with a toy with something that's a choking risk? No, you don't remove it first. If you remove it, what does the kid do? Wah! And 5 minutes later, it's back there. What does a wise parent do? Yeah, look, here. Distraction, some alternative. The kid wants to play. We all want to have fun. We want to play. We need our needs met. What is our current? What's stuff doing for our needs? Is there a healthier way that you can put something in place? Don't tell people just get rid of stuff. What is it that we want? I'm getting the message here to hurry up. But I like wandering. That's all right. We can sell this because there's benefits. If we have a less dependence on fossil fuels, we can be healthier and happier. A study done near Detroit showed that there was a 6% increase in obesity for every additional hour spent commuting. So if we can get people out of cars and get them cycling, riding their bikes, walking, it'll help to improve community, decreased social isolation, you've got more time for things. So our design of cities is really important, and we're moving into a very urban world, and so that's really important. Air pollution has a lot of deaths. If we can get people out of cars again, reducing meat consumption decreases colon cancer, but it'll also have a lot less of an impact on the world. Improved fuel-efficient stoves in India and other places means they don't have to collect so much firewood or make charcoal, and they'll have less TB and less lung disease. So if we can sell the co-benefits to health as positive things, you're meeting your needs for feeding you and for getting around, but how can we do this in a healthier way, a smarter way? And this is where we can invest. So getting towards the end of my talk, what can we all do? I've got a whole list, but I'm not going to spend much time on this. This is the sort of things that you and your groups can cover. But I actually want to push you beyond this, because if someone comes to me as a GP, I like to challenge them. The other thing is, what's the point of me cutting down on my carbon footprint if someone else is just going to take the surplus that's left over? It's a bit like that argument, why should we cut down if India and China aren't going to do anything? Maybe there is something in that. Are we just delaying the inevitable, or do we need something deeper, some deeper change? We certainly need to act on the system level for a start, because without enough of us on board, we're just not going to get there. So there are solutions and people working on those, like divestment. Just a little slide that I put in. People argue about whether we should be mitigating or adapting. And I could guess as the temperature rises, we're going to have to put more effort into adapting, but we'll always still be mitigating, because there'll be health benefits by living in a less car-dependent, etc. society. So we'll still be mitigating at all of the stages, because it's not really mitigation adaptation, it's about healthy living. That we're not just burning the future and burning the past to get easy, cheap energy, which is actually not good for us to get around and to grow food, etc. This is a slide on adaptation. There's lots that we need to prepare for as well in the coming disruption, the great disruption that Paul Gilding talks about, that we need to start planning for. So that's the mitigation and the adaptation that need to coexist, not one or the other. So getting towards the end, I think what we really need to look at is the more radical things. And University College London and Lancet Commission suggested if we're going to solve this problem, we actually need to yes, move to war footing, but the way to do it is contraction and convergence. Those of us who use more than our fair share have to be willing to live with less. And sometimes less is more. More time for relationships, more time to enjoy what we have, to enjoy the world, not so busy earning money and looking after all our stuff. So we can sell this, that actually less can be more. And we can model that to our friends, and that there's resilience with building relationships. And that's more important than status. So we need more cooperation and less competition. If we had less competition, we wouldn't have this economic model that it's the survival of the fittest and everyone is racing to the top, or maybe it's the bottom at the moment, or over the waterfall, that we can be in it together. This is something that I use for behaviour change, so I'm going to leave you with this. That very often we look for the plan without fully going through the first steps. Paul Gilding talked about grieving. But after that, acknowledging the problem, we need to come to an acceptance. And I've put forgiveness. It might seem rather Christian, but I think that sense of this is how it is, we're in it together, that it is really important to befriend the dark side, to acknowledge our problems. And then after that, then we can try and work out where we're going once we've really accepted it.
I'd like to propose that we move on to our guest speaker, and I'm sure David and Jerry, if we have time after Jerry's talk to ask questions from the floor, But also, will you be hovering around till morning tea and imbibing? So there'll be informal chances to also ask questions, because we are just a little bit behind schedule. And I'd like to invite Jerry up now, but I've got my notes here. I'll just do a quick introduction. So our next guest speaker is Jerry Coleby-Williams. He's a curator, author, director of Seed Savers Network. He began gardening when he was 4 years old. He is a patron of Householders' Options for Protecting the Environment. He was trained by the world's foremost botanic garden, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and the world's foremost horticultural society, the Royal Horticultural Society. He came out to Australia, to Western Australia, on a botanical expedition to discover and document new plant species, and then decided to emigrate to Australia. So thank you for that. He is the presenter of ABC TV's Gardening Australia show. He's been a garden talkback radio host in Queensland and New South Wales since 1995. I believe the Gardening Australia's been going since 2000, is that correct? Yes. Ah, terrific. 27 years of hosting on our media. Jerry also lives in Bellis, in Brisbane, which is a sustainable house and garden. It's unique, and it's opened up to the public for a visit once a year. So I'll get Jerry to come up and give his presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I've been given about 20 minutes to cover a talk which normally takes 45 minutes, so I'm going to be skipping a few slides as we go through it. I'm very confident about my pitch because I have solutions which can turn Australia quite quickly into a carbon-positive country. I'm not going to cover all of the slides that I've got there. Population, well, as an individual, I was aware of global population being an issue back in the 1970s. So as a teenager, I decided I would only reproduce once, and so far, I've kept my word. When it comes down to things like energy, we have at our feet a plan called Zero Carbon Australia. And all that requires to transition the Australian economy into a renewably powered economy is 10 years and the money that we're currently spending on fossil fuels in the forms of subsidies. We know it's a great plan because our Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, launched the central plank to Zero Carbon Australia in Sydney in 2009. Now, in Australia, in the 13 years since I set up my house and garden, 50% of Australian households now do what I do. When I first put solar panels on my house, I used to have weird people coming around from councils saying how all this sort of stuff works in a domestic setting. Now I have families who garden together coming along, and those families are the households that put renewable power in their energy mix. 50% of all households in Australia using renewable power is a measure of success, and it's a measure of change. But it also is important to remember, when you look at things, you need to use joined-up thinking. A roof isn't there just to keep rain off your head, it's a rainwater collection area. It's also a solar power station. Things have multiple purposes, and to capture their value, you need to look at things in multiple ways. Now, we know about water use going up and the fact that we live in a very drought-prone country. But, you know, one of the things that we've got to remember is that some of our biggest competitors for water to use is things like coal-fired power stations. During the last drought, 2004 to 2011, coal-fired power stations were using water to operate efficiently from the dams to pump water using coal-fired power to the taps so that people could use it. Now, water is a very heavy thing. It uses a lot of energy to move it around. So every time you connect a roof to a rainwater tank and you use that rainwater tank for the household or to grow food, you're efficient. You are really effective. And that is one of the big differences between, I guess, efficiency in a business which is able to offset its costs into the economy, the wider economy, without regard to the environment. It's actually being effective. The difference between efficiency and effectiveness is an argument we need to hear. An effective household is one that harvests water from its roof, uses its roof to generate power, and grows its own food. That is the building block for sustainable living from my perspective. Now, when we talk about food security, Australia is a really small player. A really small player. In a good year, we can produce enough grain and enough meat to feed up to 40 million people, which is peanuts when you look at the world's growing population. If you look at Java, a tiny island that's not quite twice the size of the state of Victoria, they can feed 138 million people every year. And they can do it because they don't have fossil soils that we have. They get good rain and they got brand new fertile soil. And they can grow many crops in a year. When you look at Bangladesh, a twelfth of the size of Queensland. They have a population of over 140 million people, and they can feed those people in a good year, doing very well. So in the scheme of things, Australia is not a big player. When we talk about what the world can deal with, 1.5, 2 degrees of warming, well, we passed the critical point for that warming before I emigrated to Australia in 1992. 300 parts per million CO2. That was the critical thing. That's what politicians are talking about today. Well, we passed that point before I could even start talking gardening in Australia. So it's just one of those things. I was able to give a vision of what gardeners needed to do for climate change when the CSIRO produced their report on predicting the climate in 2003. And that first appeared in Gardening Australia magazine in 2004. And Gardening Australia has been pretty much silent about global warming ever since. In 2013, the CSIRO actually admitted that they got their predictions right, but they were actually happening 20 years earlier than they expected. So when I talk to my gardening audiences, we're not doing it for our grandchildren. We're not even doing it for our children. We're doing it for us, and we're doing it now. I've been gardening consciously with global warming since the 1970s, and that was when I was living in London. In 1985, this picture of my front garden, it's not very good. If you want people to get good photos of your garden, do it yourself. Don't get your sister to do it. But that was my front garden. I was flowering bottle brushes, wattles, grevilleas, all sorts of different things in my London garden in 1985. The climate had changed so much, I felt so confident I was able to garden with Australian plants in London. Rhododendrons are flowering in some places 45 days ahead of schedule. Makes it very difficult to plan a crop. In 2008, there was a federal inquiry into food and food security. It's very difficult planning something long-term like an orchard if you've got it in the wrong climate. So when I talk to gardeners about planting for the future, I explain to them that their garden is on the move and things are going to get warmer and certain things are going to disappear. Tropical birch, things like that. When you look at the world outside, in fact, what you're looking at is a historical snapshot of how the world used to be. Because since we've passed the safe climate limit, everything outside is experimental. All life on Earth is experimental. And I say to my gardeners, welcome to Planet Guinea Pig. You know, if life is an experiment, then don't be scared to experiment, but certainly work with winners. Don't work with things that are not going to work. We already know what the future impacts of climate change are in terms of pathogens. When you look at the soils, a metre deep, they don't change in temperature all year round. The soils in London, 6.9 degrees all year round. In Sydney, 13.1 degrees. So hot, tulips jump out the ground. Here in Brisbane, 16.2 degrees. If I was to dig a pit in my garden today, you'd see the soil steam. That's what it's like. Now, the difference about these temperature changes for gardeners is that when the soil's warm, certain pathogens benefit and certain pathogens don't. I've seen this in Sri Lanka, where tea plantations up in the highlands are suffering because they're getting more sun, less cloud, the rain is less regular, and nematodes, worm-like creatures that attack their root systems, They are changing. Some are responding positively to warming soils, and so they're more of a pest to the tea plants. Some are becoming less of a problem. But we know already, when you look at Sydney and Brisbane, we know what Sydney's problems are going to be like in a warmer climate, because we just move up to Brisbane, where soil has to be freely draining and well enriched with compost in order for those plants to survive our wetter summers. Pathogens stand to benefit, they become stronger. That is the future of Sydney in a warmer world. The other thing about it is that plants are certainly not static. They are responding extremely well. Grasses are major beneficiaries of extra CO2 in the atmosphere. It's down to their metabolism. They will spread, they will prosper. But chemistry in plants is changing as well. The more CO2 there is, the more toxins plants are able to produce. They can focus their energy on energy-intensive things like protecting themselves against pests and diseases. So things like cassava, one of the world's major staple crops, is becoming more toxic. Apple pips are becoming more toxic. The warmer the weather becomes, the less protein grains produce. The more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the less fibre plants produce. So thatched roofs are not lasting as long as they used to. The less zinc they produce. So food is less nutritious, as well as being less productive as our climate warms. One of the key things I deal with is non-hybrid plants. And one of the things that I do like to point out to people is when modern farmers talk about modern systems of production, they're always assuming you're using hybrids and things like genetically modified organisms. These things are very, very vulnerable to climate change. They are